ground. We never running, we just walking around. Spitting scriptures like we busting around. Screaming on them as a thief in the night. Praise y'all, what you need in your life. New Torah movement, trying to bring it to life. We fishing for them, trying to get them to fight. They walking dead, trying to bring them to life. I got that water dive in his movement. Taking them back, but it ain't school. Takes on the ground. We never run, we walk them down. That's how we do it. Torah move, I say my prayer, hallelujah. The prophets awake, spirit did me what they face. They say that I'm going up, I might have better tell them just stand where I'm staying. I stand on my two, I'm a man. I've been on that block and I can't let that stand. And keep the Torah, baby, we got that plan. If it's down, better give them my hand. Pick them up, cause together we stand. Granny had faith in a mustard seed. Uncle had faith in a bunch of keys. We sting your flat like a bunch of bees. The prophets that left, blowing the trumpet, we put in that work. They can't get for money. New Torah moving, yeah, we keeping it coming. But the tank told them if he try to go run him, we walk him down like we searching for motives. Let out those scriptures, we load up the precepts. And they got right where you live, walking on the cats of Egypt. Who were down, now we up. Don't let them fool you. I say my praise, hallelujah. Chase on the ground, we never running, we just walking around. Spitting scriptures like we busting around. Screaming on them as a thief in the night. Praise y'all, what you need in your life. New Torah movement, trying to bring it to life. We fishing for them, trying to get them to fight. They walking dead, trying to bring them to life. I got that water dive in his movement. Taking them class, but it ain't school. Takes on the ground, we never run, we walk them down. That's how we do it. Torah move, I say my prayer, hallelujah. In the making, said the boss of y'all up in the prophets got them shaking. I need my plate, no sugar, no bacon. I got my fam by my side, let me praise it. Had the bullets together cause I ripped it, but I see us make it. I told them be patient without destruction, how we save it. Awakened by y'all, we keep praying. Baby, it's so amazing. I got that water that they get thirsty. I got the bull with me. I got that ocean I swim with them sharks and there is no tool with me. Get in my heart, they play the fool with me. Can't solo, got it cool with me. Turn my mic up. Better y'all rock. New Torah movement. Tell them tanks on the ground. When I was dead, the Father raised me up. He raised me up. And all my sins, He never gave me up. No. And all my wrongs, really gave me up. They heard them tanks up on that ground, so he had to rank them up. New Torah movement. I don't been doing it. Born with that Torah, here we keep growing, hey, New Torah movement. Yeah, it's good, I know He's great. Watch out what He got you. When it ain't nobody knows the thought, but they believe I'm watching. They entertain the angels, but they don't understand. They stuck up in their pride, everybody wanna be the man. I'm surrounded by pigeons, like my tribe in the pigeons. That's a life, the jeweler vultures like thighs on the ceiling. I'm waiting on the promises, eyes on the medium. Tempted by money and love, regard your feelings. Lead I speak that spirit cause I breathe that. New Torah movement, they might become the freedom. They see the tanks on the ground, they holler freedom. When I was here, the Father raised me up, he raised me up. And all my sins, he never gave me up, no. And all my wrongs, really gave me up. They heard them tanks up on that ground, say I done raised them up. New Torah movement, I don't been through it. Or with that Torah, they keep going. Hey, New Torah movement. I put my life up on the line like a bitch, so they don't hear me, no. I get them hooked, I bet they feel me, though. They took my heart, I had to rhythm slow. Moving where the river go. No, this not a river go. I just make them feel the flow. But I don't think they really know. Got on my hormones, got my sword, it's time to really go. They walking dead, man, this really go. Make you lose your head if you really know. Tour about to really blow. Believe that, believe that. Get them my heart if you need that. Believe that, believe that. You never did, you know what we at. When I was here, the Father raised me up, he raised me up. And all my sins, he never gave me up, no. And all my wrongs, really gave me up. They heard them tanks up on that ground, say I done raised them up. New Torah, I don't been through it. Or with that Torah, they keep growing in me. Hey, New Torah,
Shalom, 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 family, peace and blessings to you. Giving all praise to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to our ancestors, to those who walked out the Torah before us, to show us how to do this thing, man, according to the law, statutes, commandments of the Most High Yah, to Yeshua, our martyr, our teacher, our good shepherd, our rabbi, our teacher, who showed us how to walk out the Torah circumspectly, our example of how to live out the law, statutes, and commandments for this day and age. Peace and blessings to you, family. I'm going to not be before you long, but I did want to just come on and just give a little bit of information, just do a part two to our previous discussion on is Jesus or Yahushua or Yeshua the good Scarabaeus, as some have touted to be. We've heard, you may have heard our good brother Jabari Osaze make this mention. Another brother, not too long ago, makes this assertion. Very few people over the years and throughout the centuries. Gerald Massey, another author by the name of Kuhn, Kuhn. He's also made these assertions, and a number of people we're going to be talking about today have also made these assertions that Christ was referred to by the name of an Egyptian god, that the story of Yahushua Yeshua was taken from the Egyptian god that they referred to as Ithacus, also the Egyptian god that they referred to or gave alliteration to as the good scarab, that this was quite an Egyptian narrative in which this was bought out from. And so we're going to get back into this information, and we're going to go right to some of the source information debunking that whole idea, right? That Yeshua, Yahushua, Jesus Christ was taken from the story of the good Scarabaeus, or there was a connection to him and the good Scarabaeus as it was told in the Kemetic or Egyptian mythos. And so we're going to be dealing with that on today. Again, peace and blessings. Shout out to you, brother KOT. Hey, listen, tune in tonight. Tune in tonight at about 9 p.m. on this channel. We're going to be listening and tuning in to our good brother KOT, Prince of Yahweh. He's going to be going in. We're going to post the notification in a little while. So for those of you who are interested in listening to another dynamic message and teaching about our brother KOT, we're going to be talking about the fall of Esau and the rise of Israel, the rise of the saints, the fall of Israel and the rise of the saints. And he has some very important information in regards to that particular topic. Information that you're going to need to have your pens and your pads ready to take copious notes, as our good sister Cassandra says. Peace and blessings to you, Professor Lovely Lady. Thank you for being in the building. Appreciate you as always. Shout out to my good brother Dominic Doulas, who's out there putting in work. Appreciate you, fam. Good to see you in the building today. Please hit the like button, like, share, and subscribe. Let someone know we're on the air, and we're going to be going into it. And so I'm going to get right into this presentation. And let's start here. Let me share my screen. Let me share my screen here. I'm going to get into it. I trust and pray that everyone has had a glorious start to their week. Giving all praises to the Most High. So this is part 2 on Is Jesus the Good Scarabaeus? We sort of broke it down a little bit on the other day, a couple of days ago. Go back and look on this channel for part 1, just to refresh, bring you up to speed. But we're really going to be getting into it on today and really going into some things, really sort of breaking this thing down. A lot of people drew this narrative out of Gerald Massey's work. We understand Gerald Massey was a monk who actually used to follow Christianity, and he began to delve into the Kemetic mythos and mythology, and began to make comparisons. Some say he made over 200 comparisons to Egyptian deities and mythos in regards to the Christ or Yahushua, or some say Yeshua, and that he made over 200 comparisons or parallel renderings that he made to make the claim that Yahushua is all Egyptian, is all created, all taken and stolen from the Egyptian mythos. And one of the things that he brought out or tried to use was a quote from one of the church, a supposed quote from one of the church fathers by the name of St. Augustine, or Augustine of Hippo, about Christ actually being, or Yahushua or Yeshua being the actual good Scarabaeus, right? Or as of the scarabs of Egypt, as they worship the scarab beetle, or this particular dung beetle, for its physical attributes. So they sort of anthropomorphized it to a degree. I wouldn't say it was a sense of almost a form of animism, but this is an insect, not an animal. This is an insect. And they basically looked at how the insect, this dung beetle, this scarab beetle, how he provided for himself, how he operated in nature. And what they observed was the dung beetle hatching from a circular ball. And the circular ball, the dung beetle, I think we showed a little bit on the video last week. that how he would roll his food out of waste and other materials. He would roll it, this sticky substance that they would produce, and they would be able to roll and roll and roll these things almost in a perfect ball, in a perfect sphere. And oftentimes what this scarab beetle would do was interject themselves into this ball, that this mass that they have rolled throughout heavy terrain. And they had instinctively been observed allowing this ball of food and waste material that was rolled and accumulated by this scarab beetle, to that at certain particular times of the day when the sun was at its highest point, that they would let it dry in the sun. So they would roll it out of the shadows and the waste and the filth that they have accumulated, and they would roll it out into the highest point directly underneath the sun and allow it to dry and harden. But as they would do that, they would insert themselves inside of it. And so the part that the ancient Kemetic people or the Egyptians would observe would be this dung beetle emerging out of this hardened shell or sphere or disc-like object. And so they sort of related that to their mythos, their mythology of Ra, the sun god, as the sun, they thought, was moving across the sky in a solar bark. It would roll, the sun would roll across the sky, across the horizon, from the upper world to the nether world, right? And so they sort of made the comparison of the dung beetle, the scarab, to this type of Egyptian mythos, right? And so some had, over the periods of time, over the centuries, have claimed that Christ, the story of Christ, Yeshua, Jesus, Yahushua, was taken from that actual mythos, and that it's all made up. That they called it the Egyptian Jesus, right? Or there is a deity that they worship by the name of Ithacus, right? And Ithacus sort of had an alliteration, or was sort of had a symbol of a fish. And sometimes y'all see Christians driving around and they got the little fish, like the little fish sign on the back of their license plates, and they got Jesus wrote in the middle of it. Well, they claim that that's an Egyptian symbol that was taken from the Egyptian Jesus Ithacus, and so they correlate that with the Christian narrative, or their Christian narrative. But we're not discussing the Christian narrative, but we're going to be talking about the first century Yeshua, Yahushua, right? We're going to be talking about that, and is these comparisons true? Were these stories, these narratives, taken from Egyptian texts? And I'm going to show you that it was not. I'm going to show you that it was not. And so we're going to get into this information. We're really going to see what it is. Shout out to Investing Out the Blue. I see you, fam. I watched this show today, brother. I watched the show today, man, that you did. I saw my name in the title of one of your shows, man. I saw my name in your show. So shout out to Blue, Investing Out the Blue, man, and to our brother Good Pseudo History is in the channel as well. Peace and blessings to you all, and to my very, very illustrious sister Cassandra Mensah. Thank you for being in the building. I appreciate you for all your words of kindness and wisdom. Thank you for being in the building and sharing with us today. So let's get into it. So that's sort of the backdrop on this thing, but I'm going to arm you today with information to prove that this is not the case. So many people tout this, and they claim that Jesus was the good Scarabaeus, and because of that, that's proof and evidence that the whole story was made up, mythos. The Bible is made up, it's mythos, because it was taken directly from an Egyptian mythos or mythology, right? So let's get into it, right? And again, here, just a little bit of recap. Gerald Massey, right? Gerald Massey, who attributed the following statement to St. Augustine, right? St. Augustine, 354 to 430 AD, who lived in Roman Africa. That's also very important. We're going to talk about some things as well. St. Augustine lived in Roman Africa, right? Or present-day Algeria, right? I don't know if many of you knew that. We're talking about St. Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, or Hippo, some people say, right? So Here Augustine regards Jesus as a scarab or a dung beetle, and this is according to Gerald Massey. Gerald Massey said that St. Augustine, quote, and said, quote, my own good beetle, not so much because he is only begotten, not because he, the author of himself, has taken on the form of mortals, but because he has rolled himself in our filth and chooses to be born from this filth itself. Now, in reading this statement, one has to understand what Gerald Massey is actually saying here. That actually he's saying that St. Augustine is correlating Yeshua or Yahushua or Jesus the Christ to the good Scarabaeus. And because he's doing this, it's taken from the story of Jesus or Yahushua or Yeshua is taken from an Egyptian text or an Egyptian mythos. This is wholly incorrect. This is very misleading and deceptive on Gerald Massey's part, because once we read St. Augustine, Bishop Augustine's quote, we're going to read it as he wrote it and in his context and listen to what he actually says, right? He says, my own good beetle, not so much because he is our begotten God. Now let's stop there. The reason why people try to make this correlation is because St. Augustine uses the term beetle here, right? But their argument is that that means that he's calling him the good Scarabaeus, which was attributed to another deity. It was attributed to another deity, Egyptian deity, right? But this is not what St. Augustine is doing. He said, my own good beetle. He said, not so much because he is only begotten God, right? Not because he, the author of himself, right? And he's not calling him God. Is really what he's saying, the only begotten of God. Why it's in parentheses there is because that word was not in the original statement. So they put God there in parentheses, right? So when he says the only begotten, it says the only begotten and that's it, right? But it's the only begotten of God is in the context, right? But the original statement or writing, quote unquote, God was inserted there, right? So it says, not because he, the author of himself, right, has taken on the form of mortals, right, but because he has rolled himself in our filth. In other words, as the gospel said, that Christ took on the sins, or Yahushua took on the sins, right? And when it says he's taken on the sins, not that he took on the sins that every individual man committed physically or in his natural body, but simply because he took on the price that had to be paid. This is why he's called the propitiation for sin in the New Testament. In other words, he gave his life in the sense of a martyrdom, right? So that we could have a greater understanding and a greater gnosis or knowledge of what it means to have eternal life that only is given by the Father. How is that done? Through Christ's teaching, through Yahweh's teachings, through the teachings that says that God and God alone is the Father. Yahweh is Father, God alone. And that we should go and return back to the relationship that we had with the Father before the fall of Adam. Get back to that relationship, right? Between the creator and the creation. Nothing else in between. That is what Yeshua was always pointing back to. Get back to that state before the fall of Adam. And so this is what he's saying when he's talked about in the form of being a sacrifice for man. Not that he's committing suicide. It's just as if I have children, right? I have children. And if I saw my son or one of my daughters are grown now. So my son, if I saw my son, my youngest, running out into the street, right? And he doesn't see a car coming, but there's impending danger, but I can see it, right? Even though I've taught him, look both ways before you cross the street, even though I've taught him, don't play in the street, it's dangerous, right? Even though I've already given him, quote, the laws, statutes, and commandments, even though I've already given him that, there's going to be some times it's possible that he's not going to have that in the forefront of his thinking, right? So if he goes out into the street and the car is coming, and I see that as a father loves with love for his son and his children, what would my actions be? My actions would be that I'm going to run out into that street behind my son, and I'm going to attempt my best to try to snatch him out of harm's way because of the impeding danger that he does not recognize, or he does not see coming, or maybe he even has ignored, right? And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to either try to grab him out of the way and push him out of the way, or shield him from that impending danger, that hurt, harm, and pain. And in the process, I'm killed and my son is saved. See, in that instance, I have just saved my son, right? So when we speak in the terms of salvation, right, when it comes to Yeshua, because I've taught my son, when it comes to salvation through Yeshua, us getting back to the law, statutes, and commandments of the Most High, us believing in his word, right, which is going back to the law, statutes, commandments. Christ himself says, anything I say, you can hang it on the law and the prophets. What is that? That's the Torah. That's the Torah. So he said, get back to the relationship, right? So in that sense, just as I was saying about my son, I have now become the martyr, right? I took on the failings or the sin, right, of my son, and in that instance, I gave my life for him. That's not suicide. That's an action of love, right? And so this is how we ought to see this when we're reading the New Testament and the understanding of Yeshua. He's not saying he can bear on the sins of the whole world, because if all the sins of the whole world were physically nailed to the cross with him, why is there still sin in the earth today and directly after that, right? So we clearly understand that this is not a wiping away of the sins of men, right? But this is an opportunity to understand that because a love was shown for him like a father to a son, right? So this is the type of thing that any of us would do for our children, or at least I would hope you would do that for your children, right? You would do whatever you can to bring them out of harm's way. And so this is the relationship that the Creator wants us to understand in the example, in the martyrdom of Yeshua. This is how this works, right? This is not a sacrifice. This is not a human sacrifice. You see? That's the difference in that. And people try to make that argument about, well, God, God doesn't take on human sacrifice. Well, we're not talking about ritual sacrifice here. There was no ritual committed here. This is not ritual sacrifice, right? So we have to understand what the scripture teaches in that particular context, right? And so moving forward, this is what St. Augustine is actually saying in this quote, right? But because he has rolled himself up in our filth and chooses to be born from this filth himself. In other words, he came to take on our filth, right? To take on our sin, right? And carry that burden that Israel refused to carry. Why? Because they refused to keep the law, statutes, and commandments of the Most High. So Yahweh Shai himself shows us that, listen, you can walk out the Torah. You can live the Torah. You can live it out in your everyday life. You can do this. And this is the example that we should follow, right? Nothing spooky about it. Nothing spooky about it, right? So this is it, just a complete restoration of the Father, right? But let's continue. Watch this. Here we have on the screen here, this is one of the renderings of Augustine, St. Augustine, or Bishop Augustine of Hippo, right? From whence this good Scarabaeus quote allegedly came from. Now, most people don't realize that he was an African. He was considered one of the early church fathers, but he was an African, right? Born in Algeria, right? So, and oftentimes folks say, well, ain't no black folks touch the Bible. They ain't had nothing to do with anything that goes into it. Well, St. Augustine was one of the most influential people and later becomes what you call Christianity today. But he was from Algeria. He was an African. He was a black man, right? Let's continue. St. Augustine, we just read that. There's another depiction of him, not from the time. But let's get to this being connected with Jesus, this ithicus, right? And so I want to show, let me see here, before I get into that. We're going to have some fun today with this. Let me see if this is the one. Let me show this real quick. Right? I hope y'all with me. This is from the Encyclopedia Britannica. And I'm going to be reading from you briefly. It's called The City of God, a work by St. Augustine. Right? And this is just more information to show and prove that there's no way that St. Augustine of Hippo was referring to Yahushua, Christ, Yeshua as an Egyptian deity. Watch this, right? Let's listen. Let's read a little bit. This is the City of God, the work by St. Augustine, right? Here. And let me try to read. Let me try to see if I can get the printed version to pop up so we can read it better. Give me 1 second. Please hit that like button, share, subscribe. See, most people don't know that a lot of those early church fathers have been whitewashed in history, especially by the Catholic Church. A lot of them. St. Augustine of Hippo being one of them. All right, let's read. Okay, the City of God. The City of God was a philosophical treatise vindicating Christianity, written by the medieval philosopher St. Augustine as Dissertative de contra Paganos, concerning the City of God against the pagans. Now, St. Augustine is writing this treatise, apology. He's writing this concerning the City of God against the pagans, right? And he wrote this about 413 to 426 CE, Common Era. And the reason why this work is important because it shows us that he had no affinity for supporting or ascribing anything of Christianity at the time to any pagan belief system, including any Egyptian deities or the great Scarabaeus or the good Scarabaeus, whatever this false narrative, the geromancy, has tried to put out there, and others try to propagate, like Jabari and others go out here and you hear him say this, right? The good Scarabaeus. They even called Jesus the good Scarabaeus. No, they did it, right? They wasn't talking about no Egyptian god. So watch this. He says, a masterpiece of Western culture, The City of God was written in response to pagan claims that the sack of Jerusalem by barbarians in 410 CE was one of the consequences. Listen, people, this is the key. This was one of the consequences, the sacking of the sacking of Rome by barbarians in the year 410 CE of the Common Era, was one of the consequences of the abolition of pagan worship by Christian emperors. Let me slow that down again. In 410 CE, Rome was overrun by what they call barbarians, or those who were not of Roman stock, right? In 14 CE. And one of the consequences that people were saying that why this thing happened was because this was because of the abolition or the abolishment of pagan worship by Christian emperors. So Augustine responded by asserting to the contrary. He says that Christianity saved the city from complete destruction and that Rome's fall was the result of internal moral decay. He further outlined his vision of two societies, that of the elect, the city of God, and that of the damned, the city of man. These cities are symbolic embodiments of the two spiritual powers, faith and unbelief, that have contended with each other since the fall of the angels. They are inextricably intermingled on this earth and will remain so until time's end. Augustine also developed his theological interpretation of human history, which he perceives as linear and predestined, beginning with the creation and the ending with the second coming of Christ. At this work's heart is powerful contrarian vision of human life, one which accepts the place of disaster, death, and disappointment, withholding out hope of a better life to come, a hope that in turn eases and gives direction to life in this world. The city of God is divided into 22 books. The first 10 refute the claims to divine power of various pagan communities. The last 12 retell the biblical story of humankind from Genesis to the Last Judgment, offering what Augustine presents as true history of the city of God, against which and only against which the history of the city of man, including the history of Rome, can properly be understood. So what he's writing here is saying, listen, the fall of Rome had nothing to do with the Christian belief or the belief in Yeshua or Yahushua. He says it completely rests on the fact of pagan worship, which included ancient Kemetic worship and deities, and the pantheons of deities that any of the people of ancient Kemet worship. So then why would Augustine come and use and make a statement calling Christ the good Jesus the good Scarabaeus when he's writing against the use of pagan worship? It doesn't make sense. You see? It doesn't make sense. So when Gerald Massey is taking his statement because he refers to Yeshua or Yahushua as a good beetle, he's not referring, Augustine is not referring to a pagan deity. And how do we know that? Because of his work here of the city of God, where he goes against pagan beliefs and rituals and practices that are contrary to that of Yeshua, Yahushua. It's clear. So one of your arguments, your best arguments when people say, well, what about Christ being called the great Scarabaeus? You say, well, look, isn't that a quote supposedly attributed to St. Augustine? And if they say yes, you say, well, Gerald Massey is the one that makes that claim. Show me where Augustine says that. Augustine never uses the term Scarabaeus, but he says beetle, right? He says beetle. But when he says that, he's talking about the salvation or the filth of one or himself being found filthy or being found in sin, being cleansed by the teachings of Yeshua. That's what he's referencing. The actual beetle itself, not the great Scarabaeus or the good Scarabaeus of the Egyptian mythos. He's not referring to that at all. Gerald Massey made that up. He completely made that up. Right? And so when people say, well, prove that he made it up, you take them right here to this work, to the City of God, written by St. Augustine himself of Hippo, the black African bishop, and you show them the work of the City of God and say, listen, read his work here, where he goes against all pagan religions. So make it make sense that he would use a pagan religion to describe Yeshua, Yahushua, or Christ. He wouldn't do that. So this is how you deal with them when they try to make these arguments, because one, they're only parroting information. They're not really researching information. They're only parroting this information, right? So let's continue, right? That's one. St. Augustine, the City of God. Read that. Let's go back. And here's another one that they also try to use, right? Gerald Massey also makes this claim also, right? And many others, right? That Yeshua or Jesus or Yahushua, he was also taken from the Egyptian deity or the Egyptian god Ithacus, who they call the Egyptian Jesus at times. Then they say, well, see, he was taken from that. Well, let's look at it, where this even comes about and how this even develops, right? So as you can see on the screen, I'm going to try to make it a little bit bigger. Hopefully I can get that to work. I might not get that to work. Go back down. But anyway, this is what he says here. It says, he says here, Jesus Christ, the Son of God and Savior, a representation of a fish used in ancient times as a pagan fertility talisman or amulet, or as a Christian symbol for the Greek word ithacus, right? Interpreted as an acrostic, in which the Greek letters are the initials of the words Jesus, right? I, Christos, CH, right? Then they have TH for Theo, right? And then the HY, right? Ios, and S for altar, meaning Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. Now, this is completely made up. This is completely made up. And you guys often see this symbol at times. Sometimes it's it's called a wheel, or it's a loaf of bread that is sliced up, right? But here is where they have the problem, right? There's no attestation that anyone during the time of the life of Christ called him or correlated him to Ithacus, the Egyptian god. No one does this. right? No one does this at all whatsoever, right? And so when we see these things occurring, these are how these things develop. And so people are wondering, why do they correlate the fish with him? You see, they had the 12 fish, and he was the fisherman of the 12 men, and they try to use the number 12 as to try to relate. You see what they did. This is how they began to correlate Ithacus with Yeshua. They can't just correlate it with his name, because you see his name right here, Iesus, right? So they said, well, how can we make this connection? So they had to add all this: Isis, Christos, Theos, Soter, which means Jesus Christ, the Son of God, Savior. You see, they had to take the first letters of each one of these words to create this word, Ithacus. And so that's how they began to correlate it to the Egyptian god later on, centuries after Christ's death. So no one ever made this claim during his lifetime or during the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century. No one ever makes these claims. And again, as you can see, there's no way until you start adding a ton of words together that you can correlate the name Ithacus with just the name of Yeshua, Yahushua, or Jesus. You have to create all of these other words and string them along together in order to get this. This is someone's play on words. It's creative writing. But no one ever follows this. I'm going to show you guys something else, right? Why they claim that Jesus is also this Ithacus or this Egyptian god, or what they call the Egyptian Jesus, right? Watch this as well. We just went over the city of God. Now watch this. I don't know if you guys can really see this. Let's see. How can I make this bigger? I think I might have to go into the actual. Let me see if I can go in here and make this a little bit bigger. Hold on one second. Let's see if I can make this bigger. See if I can make this bigger so you guys can read it with me. But you can see the book. And this is by Tom Harper, or Harper, Harpur. And he talks about the pagan Christ, right? And so what he does is he makes a lot of fantastical claims here, right? And in one of these, let me see if I can find that. If I can find that, I will bring it back out. Because in one of these, what he claims is, let's see. One of this he claims, let's see. I'm trying to get to where I can find it. But let's read it, right? This is part 2. And this is from Tom Harper's. It was on the best-selling authors list. Tom Harper, Recovering the Lost Light, the Pagan Christ, right? And it reads, part 2, Horus and Jesus are the same. This is what he espouses. So Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, Acts 7:22. He says, out of Egypt have I called my son, Hosea 11:1. which we know that's talking about Israel, because he cut in the Torah, Israel is called God's son, right? So we know this is not talking about Christ here in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1. It says, Egypt labored at the portrait of the Christ for thousands of years before the Greeks added their finishing touches to the type symbol of the ever youthful solar god. It was Egypt that first made the statue live with her own life and humanized her. Her idol of the divine. The Christian myths were first created related of Horus or Osiris, who was the embodiment of divine goodness, wisdom, truth, and purity. This was the greatest hero that ever lived in the mind of man, not in the flesh. The influence with a transforming force. Only here to whom the miracles were natural because he was not human. And that quote is from Gerald Massey in his book, Rendering the Natural Genesis. So you can see all of these guys take their information from Gerald Massey, right? And if they continue to follow the works of Gerald Massey, you'll see that he just fabricated a lot of this stuff. He never was able to quote anyone directly. He had no source information. Never was able to direct anyone to any of the primaries in his work, where he said he got quotes from, as he cited people, never citing the primary sources. This is why Gerald Massey is not taken seriously today. But what you have is you have a lot of people out here who still makes these arguments, right? They still make these arguments based on unsubstantiated works, right? Now, what we have to realize is that the reason why this is important, right, is because we see this narrative continuously being pushed that the Holy Bible, the Tanakh itself, the Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament is all fabricated and taken from Egyptian sources and Egyptian texts, right? But these are things that we can't really focus on, right? So I want to show something else. He is, and what he does is, in his book here, he tries to correlate the symbol, which we talked about, of the fish to Yeshua in the Egyptian text. That's what that was for. But let's look at what they believed in ancient Egypt, right? Ancient Kemet. We know that on the Narmer palette, and we know the Narmer palette, some of us are familiar with this image. That on the Narmer palette, it shows Nimrod, right? Or some say Narmer, right? Or King Menes, right? But Narmer standing here. So this is the front. This is the front side of it, and this is the back side of it. And this little circle part here is where they would put makeup. So it's really a makeup palette, right? It's where they would put their makeup on, right? And so, but on here and carved and engraved are different images, right? There are different images here. Now watch. It says the Narmer palette, also known as the Great Hierapolis palette, or the palette of Narmer, is a significant Egyptian archaeological find dating from around the 31st century BCE. This is important. So that's 3100 BCE, belonging at least nominally to the category of cosmetic palettes. It contains some of the earliest hieroglyphic inscriptions ever found. The tablet is thought by some to depict the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under the king Narmer, right? But here's a significant image that you will see on this palette, right? So the Shreks bear the rebus symbols, right? Or the Ner, or the catfish. And the mirror, or the chisel inside, being the phonetic representation of Narmer's name, right? So we see here that even at the time of 3100 BCE, before you have an alliteration to an ithacus of an Egyptian deity being recorded or even being called the good Jesus, you see here that Narmer here, as part of his name, is represented by what? A catfish. So we know a catfish held some type of symbolism. A fish held some type of symbolism to the people of ancient Egypt, right? Because this is often what they would garner from the Nile, the catfish, right? And so look at these different things here. This is another reason why, according to our dietary laws, we're not to eat anything without scales, right? We know that the catfish does not have scales, right? And so we know this is a scavenger fish. It's a bottom-feeding fish. It would eat from the waste of the seabed floor. It was not very healthy to eat. So Moses, as he was teaching the children of Israel, saying, listen, you're going into another land. You're going to see these things. Don't eat from these things. Don't eat from these things. They're not good for the body, right? And so even in that, we know that there could be no connection with the any Israelite people or an Egyptian people worshiping or Israelite people at the time worshiping as the Egyptians do, or taking some type of preeminence with this type of fish, the catfish, because it was a fish without scales. And that's what this ithacus was. It was correlated to a catfish. So when Gerald Massey tries to make this claim about how he's connecting Israelite and later on Christian identities to these symbols, especially in ancient Kemet of the catfish, he's incorrect. They wouldn't have made any association with it. So for him saying, "Oh, they grafted this story from Ithacus, who was also known to be a catfish at times," right? Israelites would not have made that connection. They would not have done that. You see? So you see how he just convolutes information, smashes things together, and hope they'll stick. And my reasons for this is really to show people that simply because you hear people say something, oh, Jesus is called the great Scarabaeus, their point is not just to connect Christ to whether you follow him or not, whether you call him your Lord and Savior or not. That's not the issue that I'm making here. My issue is that this is what they use to try to attack the Hebrew Bible as a whole, because they love to call it all a fabrication. So what you must learn how to do is address the fabrications, right? And look for their routes into these arguments, right? And so this is one of the ways that you attack this argument. How can he be correlated to the great god, to the Egyptian god Ithacus, when one of his symbols was a catfish? That was something that the Israelites didn't partake of. Make it make sense, right? So this does not represent Yahushua. It does not represent Jesus. None of this does, right? And when I use Jesus, I'm using Jesus in the term. This is just a Latin, the Latin translation of what we see here, what we show here with Ithacus, right? It's just a Latin translation of this Greek rendering, right? Right here of Aesus. That's all it is. It's not Zeus. That's another thing. Because if you ever look in the Greek and look up how Zeus is spelled in the Greek, you won't get near this spelling. You won't get near the Greek spelling of Aesus. You will not get it. Completely different letters. I think you have delta, I, and then you have omega, and then something else. But you'll never see this. You'll never see it spelled out this way. Never in a million years. So when people try to say, oh, see, that is Zeus. No, it's not Zeus. It doesn't spell Zeus. Zeus is spelled a completely different way. Right? Completely different way in the Greek. And that's why I laugh at people when they try to make that claim. But let's continue. Right? So we see here the Narmer palette completely destroys that. Because before we even get to an ithacus of an Egyptian god being the symbol of a catfish, back at 3100 BCE, we have this same symbol attributed to the name of Narmer. We have this same thing attributed to his name. Who's making the claim that Narmer is the Greek god or was the Egyptian god Ithacus? Because you have the actual catfish rendering in his name. Where does that happen? You don't. Right? And that citation is Wingrove, David Wingrove, 2006, Extraordinary Bodies, and what is that? And Binding Truths, Early Writings in the Context, the Archaeology of Early Egypt. Right? You don't see these things, right? And so this is often what we see. Right? And so let's go a little bit further. Let's go a little bit further. Right? And this is what I wanted to show you guys real quick. Shout out to you, Brother D-Red. I got that info. Let me show you guys something else real quick. And show you guys where a lot of these quotes and false statements come from. All right. Let's look at this. All right. It says, no on Jesus Christ, the scarab, the dung beetle, etc. Right. And what I'm going to do is just start here with a lot of people who claim this correlation, right? So it says, homage to thee, Ra, supreme power of the God with the numerous shapes in the sacred dwelling. His form is that of the beetle. The Litany of Ra from Egyptian literature by Ephanius Wilson, right? I'm going to show you the book as well. Right? In this book, right? In this book, let me go back over a little bit so I can show y'all the title of it. They talk about Ra, Ra being connected to the great Scarabaeus, right? That is not Yahushua. So the Egyptians will tell you that Asar, the Greeks will tell you that Osiris, right, is Ra. But you won't see that among, you just let me go, there's 331 pages here. I'm going to try to put some of these in here as well. Oh, I'll try to put some of this link down here in the chat so you guys can see this. Copy this link and we'll put it in the chat so you guys can read some of this yourselves. Right. All right. Put some of these links in the chat to some of these books. Right. And let me go back. I'm almost done. I just wanted to do a part 2 on this and give you guys some of these books. So you can see there's no alliteration to Ra being paying homage to Ra and then making a correlation, as Gerald Massey tries to do, with him being the great Scarabaeus or the great beetle, right? Or that there's no alliteration where Christ takes the form of a beetle, right? Watch this. It says, I'm going to give you another quote. These creatures, like many others in the insect world, deposit their eggs in the ground where they are hatched, and the appearance of their progeny. Hold on, let me go back to that. Let me share this time so you can see what I'm reading. It says, these creatures, like many others in the insect world, deposit their eggs in the ground where they are hatched, and the appearance of their progeny rising from the earth is by some writers supposed to have suggested to the Egyptian priesthood the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. Certain it is that beetles were very common in Egypt, and one of them, that styled by naturalist Scarabaeus Satyr, right, was an object of worship. So the Egyptians worship this dung beetle because they try to connect it to some type of resurrection of the dead, right? By the beetle coming out of the dung, or the beetle releasing itself out of the filth and the dead things that it had collected and rolled itself in, right? So this was an object of worship, and this fact gives strength to conjecture that this creature is meant in Exodus 8, as the sacred character of the object would naturally render its employment as a plague doubly terrible. So you see here in the Exodus chapter 8, they talk about the here, I'm gonna pull it up. And some make this alliteration that it should be beetles here, right? Let's go Exodus chapter 8. All right. Close that. Exodus chapter 8. Let me share that so you guys can see it. Right. To it. Exodus chapter 8. This is where we are. I don't know if I want to read all of this, but I want to get down to it. Here, we start at verse 21. It says, else if thou wilt not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies upon thee, and upon thy servants, and upon thy people, and into thy houses. And the houses of the Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground whereon they are. And I will sever in that day the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, to the end thou mayest know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. And I will put a division between my people and thy people. Tomorrow shall be thy sign. And the Lord did so, and there came a grievous swarm of flies into the house of Pharaoh, and into the servant's house, and into all the land of Egypt, and the land was corrupted by reason of a swarm of flies. Let's go down here a little bit further. Right. to this end part right here. It says, and Moses said, behold, I go out from thee, and I will entreat the Lord that the swarm of flies may depart from Pharaoh, from this servants, from this people tomorrow, but let not Pharaoh deal deceitfully anymore in not letting the people go to sacrifice to the Lord. And Moses went out from Pharaoh and entreated the Lord, and the Lord did according to Moses' word, and he removed the swarm of flies. And so some translations, older translations of this text, interprets flies as a swarm of beetles or scarab beetles. And one of the reasons why this was even more important than flies, because we know flies carry sickness and diseases, right? But the dung, there's some species of flying dung beetles that carry waste from other animals. And this would have even been more devastating because they fed off waste of other animals, just as flies do, but they also made their home in the waste of other animals, right? As you would see these dung beetles rolling this waste along the ground, right? And then embedding themselves in it. So this type of beetle or a swarm of beetles is in some older translations would have been probably a much more devastating impact in regards to the 10 plagues of Egypt. So that's what it's saying there in the rendering for a possible swarm of beetles. Now let's go back here real quick. I'm just showing why these things are just not connected to the Israelites or connected to Yeshua, as some try to make the argument. And that's the reason why they call it a dung beetle, because it lives, it eats, it wraps itself, it lives in waste, right? So let's go to another quote here, right? Let's go to another quote here. You show you how ridiculously crazy this is. Here's another one. The author writes that according to Massey, Gerald Massey, here he is again. I told you, they all based their work off Gerald Massey. The beetle-headed kepper, Ptah, is Cancer. The beetle, and later the crab, the sons, S-U-N-S, of God, by Akira Y.S. Now, this is the actual real name of the young lady who wrote under the name D.M. Murdoch, where we get the Zeitgeist films and Zeitgeist books come from. This is her actual real name. This is actually D.M. Murdoch right here, right? And so she also draws off the unsubstantiated work of Gerald Massey, who makes this claim about Yeshua, Yahushua, Jesus Christ being the good Scarabaeus, or being referred to as the Scarabaeus, or being taken from the Egyptian god Ithacus. It's wholly false. It's wholly false. Let's see here. It says here, the author goes into detail about Kepper, the scarab, and Isis, Nephestis, rolling a ball, and also mentions Ambrose. Who is Ambrose? He's another bishop. Actually, he was the student of St. Augustine, of Bishop Augustine of Hippo. Ambrose was. So at the Book of Beginnings, Part 2, by Gerald Massey, he also tries to make this connection, right? It fails miserably. The author has some interesting thoughts about the allegorical meaning of the dung beetle in terms of Christian theology. Who is this King of Glory? Alvin Boyd Kuhn. Kuhn is another one who facilitates these arguments, right? And so Boyd and Kuhn, Alvin Boyd Kuhn draws directly off Gerald Massey, who has no substantiated work. He gives no primaries for any of these things he ever says Gerald Massey does. None at all whatsoever. And we could go on for days. I have tons and tons of quotes, right? where it shows and debunks Christ ever being mentioned or called the great or the good or the eternal Scarabaeus, as in being worshipped by the Israelites or Christians as an Egyptian deity. Makes absolutely no sense. There is no evidence for it. It's all made up. It's all made up. And so I just wanted to come on here real quick. Yes, she says she said that Egypt record these plagues. Actually, if you look at the Imperial Papyrus, and some people argue against this based on the timeline, but I think it fits it perfectly. If you read the Imperial Papyrus, IPWUER, if you read the Imperial Papyrus, it's going to give you, it's going to talk about rivers turning into blood. It's going to be talking about the wailing of the deaths of the people. It's going to be talking about the swarms of locusts or flies or beetles, right? It's going to talk about all these things that we actually see in the biblical narrative, right? So let me make that my last thing real quick, because that's a good question. People want to say that. Let's look at the plagues in the Imperial Papyrus. And I'll just do it here on Wiki real quick. But there's quite a bit of sources to this. But for the sake of time, right? You see here the Imperial Papyrus. This is what it's called, and it's officially called Papyrus Lenin 344 recto. It's an Egyptian heretic papyrus made during the 19th dynasty of Egypt, and now held in the Rijksmuseum van Arnhem in London, Netherlands. It contains the admonitions of Impera, an incomplete literary work whose original composition is dated no earlier than the 12th dynastic period. And based on some scholarly works, this is the same time that most people will put the Exodus for the early exit for the late. I'm not saying it for the Exodus during the for a late dynastic period. They say this comes before that, right? This admonitions of Impera. But let's read what it says, right? So this would have been dated before our Exodus, right? Hold on. Something ain't working here. But anyway, let's do this. Right. And one of the things that I argue is that we find a lot of these things being copied. So in the poem, Impera, a name typical of the period 1850 to 1450 BCE, right? Many people put the Exodus around 1450 BCE. So it's arguably within the time frame that some people argue the biblical Exodus, right? So it complains that the world has been turned upside down. A woman who had not a single box now owns furniture. A girl who used to look at her face in the water now has a mirror, while the once rich man is now in rags. He demands that the Lord of all, a title which could refer to the king or the created sun god, destroy his enemies and remembers his religious duties. This is followed by a vivid description of this order. There is no longer any respect for the law, and even the king's burial inside the pyramid has been desecrated. The story continues with the recalling of better days until it abruptly ends due to missing final part of the papyrus. How convenient. It is likely that the poem concluded with a reply of the Lord of all, prophesying the coming powerful king who would restore order, right? And let's look at some of the things it talks about. Let me see if I can find it really quickly. Right, here we go. The Impera and the Book of Exodus. His ultimate put forward in popular literature is confirmation of the biblical Exodus, most notably because of his statement that the river is blood. and its frequent references to servants running away. It talks about an exodus of servants, just like the biblical narrative does. The river turning to blood. It says this assertion has not gained acceptance among the majority of scholars. There are disparities between Apura and the narrative of the book of Exodus, such as that the papyrus describes the Asiatics as arriving in Egypt rather than leaving, but it does place Asiatics there, right? So the papyrus statement that the rivers of blood phrase may refer to red sediment coloring the Nile during disastrous floods, or simply a poetic image of turmoil. Yeah, absolutely. A poetic image of turmoil. So we do have some things that does allude to it, and this is not the only thing, but this is one of the things that bears more scrutiny. It does bear more scrutiny. And so with that, let's see here. I wanted to get to some of you guys' questions. Yes, Sister Cassandra says, flies and beetles conflated. Do you think the confusion is due to translation or transliteration? It's absolutely due to translation. Absolutely due to translation. Because of what or translation, because what we call flies, they don't. It simply refers to as insects, and the beetle being an insect, right? So when we're reading flies in the biblical narrative, it's saying insects, or some older translations is reading as beetle. It's reading as a beetle, which is an insect, right? So that's some of the things that I wanted to bring out. But I wanted to end there, and I'm going to be back on later with our brother KOT. So peace and blessings to y'all, fam. Thanks for joining.
Around, we never running, we just walking around. Spitting scriptures like we busting around. Screaming on them as a thief in the night. Praise y'all, what you